In 2006, my best friend Nick was KIA in Iraq. We used to wrestle/fight until one of us submitted. These sessions would start randomly, and always be initiated by showing your fangs. This involved pointing your pointer and middle finger down in front of your mouth, while growling at the other person. A couple of weeks after his death, some family from the other side of the country, that we only see every 5 years or so, was visiting. My cousin's son, who was about 5 and who I never met prior to this visit, comes over. He gives me their fangs, and smiles. I asked him, "Where did you learn that?" He says, "Your friend says hi," and runs away. I went to my room and cried for a bit. When my son was 3, he told his mom that he was a cosmonaut the last time he was a grown-up. Not an astronaut. The Russian version. We're 99% certain he hadn't heard the word before. When my daughter was 3 and starting to talk clearer, she was talking to someone. And concerned, I walked into the bedroom. No one was there. Initially, I thought it was her playing with her toys. Days later, the same scenario, but this time I asked who she was talking to. She replied, "Your grandma." I thought she meant my mom who had recently passed, so I showed a picture of her and asked, "Is this her?" "No, your grandma." I found a picture of my grandma and with a big smile, she said, "Yes, her." I was shocked since I don't have pictures of my grandma displayed, and she died in 1991. My daughter was born in 2015. When my daughter was about 3 years old, she would say the word specs all the time. Like constantly. I'm thinking, this is so bizarre. Why would a child randomly start saying this? Then my wife told me that her grandfather used to work for a company called Specs. The grandfather has been deceased quite a long time, and was never even alive since my daughter was born. She used to say things to me, like, when I was an adult, I used to do XYZ. My daughter, when she was 3, used to talk about her imaginary friend all the time. Said he was big and fun, and spent a lot of time playing with her. One day I was scanning old photos and had a photo of my father on my desk, and she said, "Hey, how did you get a photo of my friend?" I instantly got shivers down my spine. My father died in the house about 15 years previously, and she played in a room that used to be his office. I cautiously asked her to tell me more about her friend, and without hesitating she told me and talked funny. The chills stopped me dead in my tracks, because Dad was an Aussie who never lost his accent. My daughter talks about her grandson all the time. I thought it was just an imaginary friend, but then a couple nights ago she came out of her room at bedtime, absolutely sobbing, and said, "I'm sad because I miss my grandson. He lives in my old house in my old neighborhood." She has never lived anywhere other than this apartment. To answer some questions, we have asked her about him, but it's pretty hit or miss on whether she'll actually answer or just think it's a fun game. The other night, after some questions, she told us that he sleeps in a crib and has a white tongue. But when I asked her his name a few hours ago, she said Guga and laughed. It totally could be just her imagination, but she also told me some weird things about the baby I lost a few months ago, which really makes me wonder if she remembers or knows things we don't. Apparently used to have rather frequent bouts of nightmares back when I was 4. And it always began with me screaming the name Sarah, then calling for help loudly, which would wake pretty much everyone in the house up, and ending with me just blubbering out, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," over and over and over again, all the while crying and sobbing. When I would wake up in the morning, I'd have no recollection about any of this. My parents had no idea what caused it, given that they knew no one named Sarah that I had interacted with. We had no TV or anything of the sort, I hadn't begun going to preschool yet, and didn't know how to read beyond a few simple words. Nothing they did seemed able to stop it either. The whole thing went on for a good long while. Almost a year. Until one day, it just sort of stopped. Mom apparently tried asking me once about it, and Kid Me said something to the effect of, "Sarah doesn't want to see me crying anymore. So I won't." Didn't actually know any of this happened until some years back, when I got to talking to my parents about how I always found the name Sarah to be beautiful. Not me, but a friend's little sister. The whole family was out for dinner at a restaurant, in a skiing village which they recently bought a cottage near. My friend's little sister, as soon as they walked in, said, "I know this place. My mother and I used to paint here." To which her mother replied, "We've never been here before, what do you mean?" She replied with, "No. My mother from before. We used to paint here all the time." The family was obviously a little freaked out but didn't think much of it, as she was pretty young, and they figured just messing around. Later on though, when talking to the waitress, the little girl again adamantly mentioned how she used to paint there, and the waitress revealed that it in fact was an art studio for many years in the 1900s, but had been converted sometime in the early 2000s into a restaurant. Needless to say, the entire table, waitress included, got goosebumps and were at a loss for words. I don't know how old I was, but when I was young, less than 6 years old, I was in the car with my parents and I said something like, "Oh, I used to live there," while pointing at a house we were driving past. Turns out it was my great-grandmother's house. Not a mom, but I was a nanny for many years. This is going to be long, and I apologize in advance. One of my little ones, 2 years old, an incredibly smart child, way ahead developmentally in almost every way. He used to like to tell me things while we got him ready for bed. It was almost always these weird stories, which would always start with "when I was an old lady." And they were always very specific, little day in the life of type things, which I quickly realized went beyond the life experience and typical vocabulary of a 2-year-old. Over a few months, he kept adding very consistently to this story. He would also sometimes play as this old lady, with a cloth over his head and walking slowly as if his back pained him. Grocery shopping or playing with his sister's dolls, as if they were his grandchildren, was his favorite when he did this. He added some specific details, like how many children she had. 4 daughters and a son. And how many grandchildren. Her husband had died in his 50s. Same age as one of his uncles. From a lung disease. One of her daughters had died in their 30s in a car accident, leaving 2 children who she took in with the help of another daughter. She had a bad back and pain in her feet. One of her daughters would rub her feet to help with the pain. All but one of her children were married. The unmarried daughter lived with her and she worried that she would never marry. She remembered dying. She had been crossing a street and was hit by a car. She described how people stood around her, where it hurt, how someone eventually lifted her into a car, no ambulances, and took her to hospital where she died. I was not his only nanny, and he was consistent with these stories. Us nannies would get together and swap stories and I would write them down, because I had been fascinated with phenomena like past lives before this, and wanted to see where it all went. He also described the house and neighborhood they lived in. This is especially interesting, as this kid came from a super wealthy family, and had never even seen the kind of housing or poverty he was describing. He also talked about living by the seaside. Months into this unfolding, we visited a seaside city on the other side of the country. One day a family member there was having a birthday party, so we piled in the van to drive over, and our driver got lost. This is pre-Google Maps and smartphone times. We ended up driving through this extremely poor neighborhood, and suddenly my little boy started shouting and screaming, and insisted we turn down a couple of specific streets. He started pointing out the window and telling us things he was recognizing from "when I was an old lady." It matched to what he'd previously described in general, and we were all so interested, that we let him direct us where to go, as we were already going to be late for the party anyway. He accurately described what we would see round the next turn several times, but got extremely confused and upset when he got to where our house was, because it was now a store. The driver leaned out the window and asked a nearby old person what had been there before the store, and was told houses. We never went back there or were able to get any additional verification. Totally understandably, his parents were concerned about this storytelling and how vivid and strange it was. So after this dramatic incident we made an active effort to redirect him to other stories and play types. As he approached 3, he started telling less and less of these stories, and they got less and less specific. By about 3.5, he couldn't even remember telling us stories about being an old lady. He thought we were joking with him. To this day, over 25 years later, I can explain it really.